Imagine a gray morning at Birkenau where the sky never truly turns blue because of the thick black smoke billowing from the crematoria, waiting to swallow the souls of the recently departed. Amidst the stench of burning flesh and the heartbreaking screams of separated families, an eerie sound arises. It is not the crack of a gunshot, nor the roar of the guards. It is Mozart, it is Schubert, it is the marches of Strauss. The melodious, haunting music emanates from an orchestra of gaunt women, trembling in their striped prisoner uniforms. And standing there, conducting this grotesque performance with a chilling composure, is Maria Mandl. Maria Mandl did not resemble the hideous monsters of legend. She was a good-looking woman, blonde, with sharp blue eyes, always appearing in an SS uniform pressed without a single wrinkle. At age 30, Mandl was not just an officer. She was the Lagerführerin, the highest-ranking female commander of the Auschwitz-Birkenau women's camp. But in the minds of the prisoners who managed to survive, she was simply the beast. To understand the psychological core of Maria Mandl, we cannot look solely at the victim counts. We must look at how she used music. To a normal mind, music is the sublimation of the soul, a symbol of beauty. But for Mandl, music was a sophisticated surgical tool used to maintain order in an earthly hell. She did not view music as art. She saw it as a solvent to humanize the process of genocide in the most morbid way possible. Observe Mandl on the selection ramp, the place where life and death were decided by a mere flick of a finger. When freight trains packed with people came to a halt, the doors opened and thousands of panicked humans poured out. Mandl would order her women's orchestra to begin playing. She wanted the music to be upbeat, cheerful. Why? To reassure those about to enter the gas chambers. To make them believe that where there is symphonic music, there cannot be a cruel death. This is the very core of brutality, an inverted empathy. Mandl understood human psychology well enough to know that fear causes chaos, and chaos reduces the efficiency of the killing machine. Therefore, she used beauty to sugarcoat death. While children were being torn from their mothers, while the elderly and weak were pushed to the left, the side of death, Mandl could stand there, lightly tapping her foot to the rhythm. A detail that says it all about this deviance is how Mandl could slap a musician across the face just because she played a wrong note in a Beethoven sonata, even as hundreds of people right next to them were being herded into dark bunkers to inhale Zyklon B gas. To Mandl, a wrong note was more deserving of punishment than the ending of a human life. Under Mandl's rule, the Birkenau women's camp became a stage for extreme contrasts. She had an intense passion for selecting women with musical talent for her orchestra. She gave them small privileges, a little more food, cleaner clothes, exemption from heavy labor, but in return they had to become indirect executioners through their instruments. They had to play music as their compatriots marched into the ovens, and they had to play during public executions to drown out the groans of those gasping for air on the gallows. Mandl's psychological detachment reached its peak in the way she treated her toys. Once, Mandl selected a beautiful Jewish boy from the line heading toward the gas chambers. She brought him to her office, dressed him in the finest clothes, fed him pastries, and walked him around the camp by the hand like a benevolent mother. For a few days, Mandl enjoyed the role of a gentle woman who loved children. But when the play began to grow boring, when the core of brutality rose up against the pretense of kindness, Mandl personally led the boy to the gas chamber. She returned to her desk, put on a piece by Wagner, and continued signing death lists as if nothing had happened. What went on in that mind, Mandl felt no conflict. To her, brutality and beauty were not mutually exclusive, they complemented each other. Mandl's evil was not an outburst of rage, but the calculation of an architect wanting to build a perfect order where death was arranged according to the correct rhythm. She viewed the elimination of unworthy people as a hygienic task, and music was the perfume used to cover the stench of that duty. Justice is often seen as something that arrives late, but it always operates with cold precision. By late 1944, as the echoes of symphonies at Auschwitz began to be drowned out by the long-range artillery of the Red Army, Maria Mandl began to realize her music was reaching its final movement. But instead of facing the end with the pride of one who once held the power of life and death, the beast revealed her true nature, a coward hiding behind a uniform. In January 1945, Mandl hastily shed her laundered SS uniform, abandoned her command, and fled west, hoping the chaos of war would swallow her identity. She hid in her native Austria, attempting to blend into the flow of refugees, pretending to be a victim of the war rather than the one who caused it. But the deadly melodies she had conducted were not so easily silenced. Her former musicians, those who survived the hell thanks to their violins and flutes, never forgot the face of the woman who forced them to play music amidst clouds of ash. The question remains, how could a woman educated in a civilized society, who loved classical music and possessed high aesthetic taste, turn herself into such an unfeeling entity? The answer lies in the fact that Mandl never considered her victims to be human. In her world, there were only two types of entities, the conductors and the trash that needed to be swept away, the dissonance. Music did not make Mandl more compassionate. It only provided her with an excuse to believe she belonged to a noble class, someone with the right to determine the sounds of life and death. Mandl was hiding in the forests and ruined towns of Austria, still believing she could escape the sentence destiny had already composed. But the music of justice was beginning its first notes, deep and unstoppable. The music has stopped. When the Red Army soldiers entered to liberate Auschwitz in January 1945, they did not find Maria Mandl. The Queen of Death had vanished, leaving behind a scattered orchestra and burial pits that still smoldered with smoke. The score she had composed for herself moved into a new movement, the movement of flight and the collapse of a power fantasy. Mandl's flight was not merely a military evacuation, it was an anatomy of cowardice. Observe this detail. The woman who once spent hours meticulously grooming her SS uniform, who once slapped prisoners for a tiny smudge on the floor, was now hurriedly shedding the symbols of her power. Mandl traded her uniform for tattered civilian clothes, attempting to mold herself into the most ordinary form possible. The pride of a Lagerführerin vanished, replaced by the instinct of a hunted beast. She hid in the mountains of Bavaria and Austria, seeking shelter in her homeland. There is a cold irony here. Mandl hoped to find compassion and protection from the very society she had helped rot with genocidal ideology. In Mandl's mind at that time, the world seemed to have turned upside down. Those she once considered subhuman now held her fate in their hands. Every footstep on a trail, every rustle of dry leaves made her jump. What was this feeling? It was fear, the very emotion Mandl had distributed to tens of thousands of others as a daily necessity, and now she had to taste it in its purest form. In August 1945, the game of hide-and-seek ended. U.S. forces arrested Mandl in Munich. Upon interrogation, the true face of the Auschwitz music analyst began to emerge under the light of truth. Mandl did not scream, she did not act aggressively. She employed a classic psychological tactic of war criminals, calculated indifference. In initial interrogation reports, Mandl answered questions in a flat, almost bored tone. When asked about the gas chambers, she spoke of procedure. When asked about the murdered children, she spoke of orders. For Mandl, evil had been bureaucratized to perfection. She did not see herself as a murderer. She saw herself as a devoted civil servant who had excellently performed her assigned duties. This is the core of the danger. Mandl had completely detached her actions from their moral consequences. She was like a clock that still kept perfect rhythm, even when placed in a room full of corpses. But that composure began to crack when the Americans decided to extradite her to Poland. For SS officers, falling into Polish hands was a painful death sentence. Why? Because Poland was where Mandl's most horrific crimes had taken place. It was where the victims were no longer names on paper, but real fathers, mothers, and children. When escorted to Krakow to face trial, Mandl was no longer the beautiful beast standing on the orchestra podium. She was locked in a cramped cell, facing the terrifying silence of the prison guards, people who might have lost their entire families at her hands. Here, the psychological contrast became most vivid. Mandl began to complain about sanitary conditions, the lack of frequent baths, and the lack of respect for the dignity of a woman. The woman who had stood by and watched thousands of other women stripped naked and pushed into gas chambers now felt insulted by minor deficiencies in personal comfort. Why this contradiction? It was because Mandl still believed in a human hierarchy. In her worldview, she was still a real human, entitled to kindness, while her victims were nothing more than biological entities. This ultimate selfishness was the shield that helped her maintain sanity in the face of the colossal crimes she had committed. During the preparation for the Auschwitz trial in Krakow, prosecutors gathered testimony from former members of the women's orchestra. These testimonies spoke not only of beatings or killings, but of the mental torture Mandl inflicted through music. One witness recalled that Mandl often stood at her office window, forcing the orchestra to play the most cheerful tunes while she observed the line of people lumbering toward crematorium IV. She enjoyed the music like a connoisseur, closing her eyes to feel the melody while the smell of burning flesh from the chimneys wafted past her nose. This detail strips away the entire pathology of Mandl's soul. She used beauty to paralyze her own conscience. Music was a spiritual opiate that helped her believe she was still a person of culture, someone who appreciated beauty, even while her hands were drenched in blood. At the trial, Mandl had to face the women she once considered her toys. Her former musicians stood there, frail but steadfast, looking directly into the eyes of the one who had tormented them. Mandl's reaction: she looked away. For the first time, the power of the gaze had shifted. Mandl could no longer use her sharp blue eyes to make others tremble. Now, it was she who had to bow her head under the weight of the truth. Justice is not hurried, but it arrives with the precision of a machine. The trial in Krakow was not just a legal process, it was a public psychological autopsy. Each of Mandl's masks was peeled away, from devoted officer and music lover to serial killer. When the death sentence was pronounced on December 22, 1947, Mandl did not cry. She accepted it with a cold indifference, an indifference she had practiced through thousands of selections at Auschwitz. But in the darkness of the cell awaiting execution, that indifference began to waver. Mandl began writing letters for clemency, pleading that she was merely a small cog in a giant machine. She tried to cling to life with a cowardly desperation, a total contrast to the composure she demanded of her victims as they entered the gas chambers. The preparation for Mandl's death was a process of stripping away all false aura. No more music, no more uniform, no more power. There was only a woman facing her own darkness. And in that darkness, perhaps for the first time, Mandl heard the true sounds of Auschwitz, not the music of Mozart, but the screams of the souls whose lives she had stolen, echoing like a symphony of retribution. Mandl was counting down her final days in a cold cell in Krakow. Her music had reached its lowest notes, and the gallows were waiting at the finale. January 1948, Montelupich prison in Krakow, Poland, was submerged in a bone-chilling cold, a cold that emanated not just from the gray stone walls, but from the deathly silence of the corridors leading to execution. In cell number 14, Maria Mandl sat, facing the final moments of her life's composition. There were no violins, no roar of the crematoria, only the dry thumping of a heart counting down. Observe the shift in Mandl's psychological structure at this moment. The woman who once saw herself as a composer of mass death was now attempting to find a final reconciliation, but in a calculated and theatrical manner. Only days before being sent to the gallows, Mandl requested to meet Stanislawa Raczul, a Polish prisoner who had survived the hell of Auschwitz under her command. Why now? Why would someone who viewed human life as dross seek forgiveness from a former number? It was not genuine remorse, it was the final effort of an arrogant ego wanting to clean its score before the curtain fell. Mandl took Raczul's hand and uttered, "I am sorry, I beg your forgiveness." This detail exposes the ultimate contrast. A woman who had directly signed the execution orders for tens of thousands was now groveling for absolution from a single person. It was spiritual selfishness. Mandl did not regret what she had done. She only regretted that her status had been stripped away. January 24, 1948. Dawn had not yet broken over the Krakow sky. Maria Mandl was led out of her cell. Look at the small details that strip away her psychology during this final journey. She no longer wore the crisply pressed SS uniform but gray prisoner clothing. However, Mandl still tried to maintain as tidy an appearance as possible. Vanity, the core of Mandl's personality, persisted until her last breath. She smoothed her hair and adjusted her collar, as if preparing to step onto an orchestra podium rather than the gallows. The walk to the place of execution was a grotesque simulation of the walks Mandl had forced tens of thousands of others to take, but this time there was no symphony orchestra playing a march to reassure her. There was only the sound of the guards' boots pounding against the cold stone floor. This rhythm, steady and ruthless, was the sound of justice. Each step was a note in the funeral march that Mandl was forced to listen to herself. As she stood before the gallows, the arrogance of an SS officer was finally crushed by the physical reality of death. Mandl saw her former comrades, the once brutal figures who were now merely trembling corpses waiting their turn. The sharp blue eyes that had once stopped the hearts of prisoners with fear were now wide open, reflecting the silhouette of the swaying rope. What went through that mind as the noose began to slip over her neck? Did Mandl remember her musicians? Did she hear the screams of the children torn from their mothers on the platform years ago? Justice in this moment was not a noisy trial but an absolute silence. A silence that Mandl had tried to cover with music for years was now rushing back, swallowing her whole. When the executioner pulled the lever, the trapdoor opened with a dry thud, a final note, sharp and ending all dissonance. Maria Mandl's body fell, and in a brief moment of agony, the beast returned to being a mundane biological entity. There was no glory, no ideology, no art, only a corpse dangling in midair, stripped of all titles and authority. Justice performed its duty with the precision of a surgeon. It excised the tumor named Maria Mandl from the body of humanity. Her body was not returned to her native Austria, nor was it buried with any ceremony. It was transferred to the Institute of Anatomy at the University of Krakow for medical research. A bitter irony, the one who once viewed humans as experimental subjects, who turned death into an artistic performance, finally became an anonymous specimen under the surgical blade. The symphony of brutality ended in the stillness of an unmarked pit. Maria Mandl tried to use beauty to justify evil, used music to drown out the screams of victims. But ultimately, history remembers her not as an art lover, but as living proof of how distorted the human soul can become when it abandons compassion to serve a blinded ego. The final question lingering in the corridors of Auschwitz is not, why did she do it? But how do we stop those sounds from ever rising again? Justice is not just the hanging of a criminal, it is the cold reminder that evil, even when wrapped in the most melodious tunes, will eventually be crushed by the weight of truth. The curtain has closed, the conductor is dead, and all that remains is the ash of a morbid dream of power.